So hi, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for making time to be here with us today. We're recording this meeting, but only the people who are on video will be recorded in the recording. Before we begin, I want to start with a land acknowledgement. The University of Wisconsin-Madison occupies ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place that their nation has called Dejop since time immemorial. In an 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede the territory, and decades of ethnic cleansing followed when both the federal and state government repeatedly but unsuccessfully sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. That history of colonization informs our shared future collaboration and innovation. Today, University of Wisconsin-Madison respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with the 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. I want to welcome all of you to the 2021 spring webinar series titled Supporting Higher Education and Career Success for Refugees in Wisconsin. I'm Leslie Bartlett, the Faculty Director of the Institute for Regional and International Studies, or IRIS, and Professor in Educational Policy Studies. IRIS is pleased to co-sponsor this series with the Center for Research on College Workforce Transitions, with WCER, with African Studies, with Madison College, and with Jewish Social Services of Madison. If at any point you have a question or a comment, please feel free to add that to the chat, and then we'll have time at the end of today's presentation to look at those. So now I want to introduce Allie, my co-host for today. Allie Shepard is a doctoral student in education policy studies, and her current research is on the language and imagery used to represent asylum seekers in the British media. I'm going to turn it over to Allie, who will introduce Dr. Dryden Peterson.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for coming. I'm excited to help host this session. But before we hand things over to our guest, I'd like to introduce her and her work first. So Sarah Dryden Peterson is an associate professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and director of Refugee Reach, an initiative which brings together educators, researchers, and policymakers to co-create quality education and welcome communities in settings of mass displacement. Her research connects practice, policy, and scholarship through collaborations with communities, NGOs, governments, and UN agencies. And she has published her work in top journals as well as media outlets such as the New York Times, Washington Post, and the BBC. Through her research, teaching, and public work, she has helped shape global policy, local programs, and public conversations around creating quality, conflict-informed, and future-creating education for millions of children around the world in settings of migration and displacement. So with that all said, we're really pleased she's here today to talk with us, and I will hand it over.
Thank you so much, Allie, and thank you, Leslie, and thank you all for coming today. I'm really excited to be part of this discussion webinar series and very much look forward to the conversation that we're going to have. I'm going to be talking today about some of the ongoing work that our team has been doing related to civic education of refugees. The paper that you looked at for today and the work that I'm going to talk about draws on research studies that span the last 2 decades of work and that we have engaged in Kenya, in Uganda, in South Africa, in Lebanon. Most of these projects are collaborative ones, and today I'm going to present some more data that really speaks to and comes from a collaborative project in Lebanon that's been in partnership with Vidur Chopra, with Carmen Geha, and with Jumana Talhouk. So within the field of refugee education, we've been exploring the role that education plays in supporting refugee young people to navigate current situations inside and outside of school, and also to engage in future building, particularly connected to their roles as civic actors. One of our focuses has been to try to understand from refugee students' perspectives what they wish their teachers knew about these kinds of processes. I'll focus today on some of these ideas about what we've learned from students for teacher practice. I wanted to start with a metaphor that I hope we can kind of come back to through the discussion and as we look at these kind of big questions. This metaphor comes from a picture book, which I have adored reading with our children over many years. It's called Not a Box. And the author illustrator, Antoinette Porty, has a rabbit character who you see on the screen who starts out sitting in a box. As many of you, we've probably seen children all over the world do this. Any kind of unclaimed cardboard box becomes one of the best playthings. But as this rabbit and all children know, of course, it's not actually a box. And this happens in the book too. It's a race car. It's anything that you want it to be. But in the book, as in real life, often an all-knowing grown-up comes along and tells you what it is, gives you the right answer, and says, no, it's a box. And since the grown-up is bigger and often more powerful, that idea can really stick. What we see across space and across time is that refugee children and families often describe their experiences and the futures that they imagine for themselves as not fitting neatly into the boxes of nation state borders, into the boxes of schooling, and into the boxes of belonging. Often what they're learning in school and how they learn in school really reflects a world in which they don't fit now and for the future. So let's keep these boxes, particularly these boxes of nation states and of schooling processes, in mind through the conversation. So before getting to some of the current discussion about what we see in classrooms, I wanted to take a little step back into some history and a few big ideas to frame the discussion today. Questions about the civic education of refugees, we have really embedded in questions about the purpose of education generally, learning of what and belonging to what. As we look at a historical analysis of refugee education, most of our work is set in countries of first asylum, the neighboring countries to conflict countries. We see that the purposes of education have really shifted over time. So on the left-hand side of the slide, you see post-World War II, what I call the liberation phase of refugee education, really connected to Cold War and independence struggles, refugee education as a real community endeavor. So Zimbabwean refugees in Botswana, for example, self-organizing schools with the particular purpose of preparing leaders for a future Zimbabwe that they could imagine and plan for and create for. From about 1995, this is the middle section, what I've called the standardization phase of refugee education. It really was a time when global actors were taking responsibility for both funding refugee education, but also the content of what refugees were learning in schools. This was the era of large refugee camps in Pakistan, in Kenya, in Democratic Republic of Congo, and curriculum was often decided upon and imposed by global actors who were running these camps. Now we're in what we call a nationalization phase, where policy and global commitments to what's called responsibility sharing in documents like the Global Compact for Refugees advocate including refugees in national schools. In the US, this doesn't seem like a new idea or a radical idea, but in terms of refugee education globally in countries of first asylum, refugees prior to the past 15 years or so were typically included only in schools that were separate from national schools, often in these very isolated camps. The inclusion approach is now used in most, but not all refugee hosting countries. For example, in some countries like Malaysia, governments have rejected this kind of approach so that refugees and nationals do attend separate schools, generally with refugee education being informal, ad hoc, and with uncertain kind of certification options. In other countries, especially where refugees continue to live in camp settings, about 60% of refugees globally do live in cities. But in camp settings, like in Kenya, inclusion usually involves using the national curriculum. So in Kenya, the Kenyan curriculum in English and in Kiswahili, the official languages of instruction, even though refugee and national children are geographically isolated from each other and don't attend school together. So this is a kind of geographic separation. In some places like in Lebanon, where I'm going to talk a little bit more about today, inclusion involves refugee children attending the same schools as Lebanese children with most of the same teachers, using the same curriculum and examination systems, but at a different time of the day, Lebanese students in the morning and refugee students in the afternoon. In a few places, particularly in urban areas, refugees and nationals do attend school together at the same time in the same classrooms. In all cases, though, what we see globally is that refugees attend schools in context of national marginalization, often the schools where the poorest and most marginalized students are attending. So in Lebanon, for example, only 30% of Lebanese national students attend public schools, and yet that's the system that is available to refugees. In this context of nationalization, where refugees are included in national schools, one of the big questions that we have been thinking about is the ways in which young people connect the threads of their past, of their present, and their future selves, are able to understand or not their experiences, their private and public identities, and the ways in which past experiences and histories are shaping their current experiences in and out of schools, and in terms of how they're imagining their futures. So I'd like to talk about this idea of negative and positive peace, an idea that is used in the field of peace education, and particularly by Johan Galtung, who described the differences between a negative peace, which is the absence of direct violence, and positive peace, the absence of structural violence, the kind of violence that shows up as unequal power and unequal life chances. So positive peace is thus not only the absence of violence, but the presence of conditions that allows individuals to access equal opportunities. And I think important is that it's often assumed by global, national, and local actors that refugees find negative peace or the absence of direct violence when they arrive in a host country. Yet what we also see is that the kind of sanctuary, the kind of refuge that would provide freedom from direct violence is quite often absent or incomplete in countries of asylum as well. In these refugee settings, so acute is the need to focus on violence prevention and the means of daily sustenance that often dimensions of positive peace and the connections between present experiences and future outcomes can be all but ignored in schools. So access to these equal opportunities requires redistribution to counter resource-based inequities that refugee young people find, and recognition to counter identity-based inequities. In education, we often see that redistribution can address resource-based inequalities through standardization, through big, large-scale approaches to whatever the particular issue is. But recognition to address identity-based inequalities really cuts to the core of the tensions that we've seen come to the fore during this pandemic as well between standardization and autonomy in education. Some of the questions that become most important in refugee situations are what are the kind of trade-offs between the autonomy needed for recognition and education that could enable participation by all, kind of access issue. What are the potential costs also of the autonomy needed for this recognition in terms of weakening individuals' and communities' abilities to communicate, to trust each other, and to feel solidarity across group differences? This tension obviously is not unique to refugee education and is incredibly challenging to resolve within national education systems. And we see some of the elements of it really heightened in refugee situations. So as we think about modern nation states that are really premised on this assumption that providing services to citizens, including education, is the responsibility of that nation state. But for non-citizens like refugees, it's an ongoing question: who is responsible for their education? In a situation of standardization, what's the kind of standardizing power? Is it the country of origin, the host country, a global actor? We see different answers to that question over time. And in a situation of autonomy, autonomy from what and towards what end? And we think a lot about what are the consequences of standardization or autonomy for recognition for refugees as connected to combating the identity-based inequities that they experience. So access to social services like education could allow for full participation in society. But as James Banks notes, the notion is based on an assumption of equality that doesn't consider these kinds of identity-based inequalities. In order to disrupt them, redistribution of resources needs to be accompanied by recognition that all people having equal respect and status and the ability to participate. So positive peace is not only the absence of the acute violence, but the presence of conditions that allow individuals to access these opportunities, not only the intent of curricular recognition, but actually its outcomes. It's only realized when children have equal chances at school and future success. So for refugees, as we think about disrupting these kind of identity-based inequalities, the current nationalization phase of refugee education, where refugees are included in national systems, it's important that we think about this notion of refugees as often outside of a national imaginary of who belongs, particularly in school-based curriculum and pedagogy, so that efforts towards recognition, even within the nation state, often do not include them. So are disrupting identity-based inequalities compatible with this inclusion model of education, especially in settings where refugees typically don't have the right to work or other ways of imagining long-term futures? And this brings me to this idea of future that we have seen as really integrally connected to the possibilities of disrupting some of these inequalities. So refugees build futures in contexts of deep uncertainty, this idea of uncertainty that's taken hold in the United States in a new way over the past year as a context that many young people globally is the only context they've really experienced education. Some of this uncertainty is geographic in terms of where the future will be. For example, in Syria, in Lebanon, somewhere else entirely. Much refugee policy is really based on these static geographic conceptions of refugees' futures: return to a country of origin, integration in a context of exile, or resettlement to a distant country like the United States or Canada. These kind of geographic dimensions of future building are further influenced by geopolitics and daily experiences, in particular, the kind and length of sanctuary that a nation state provides, when it might expire, and the kinds of relationships within a context of exile over where and how young people can live and learn now and in the future. So refugee young people, as they describe to us, struggle to determine what kind of education might actually best meet their needs now and in the future, and are often planning for this future of transnationalism that's focused much less on geography and much more on the creation of opportunities. In trying to understand future building for refugee young people, we see several processes that they are engaging in shifting this focus from geography to opportunity, to the kind of positive piece that I described. First is the idea of imagined and plausible futures. So imagine futures, young people's hopes and imaginings for the long term, yet they've not yet taken concrete steps in the present toward realizing them. And in fact, uncertain if any steps in the present could lead to the realization of that imagined future. Plausible futures, instead, as a set of future possibilities that might be for the short term or that are realistic, manageable, and malleable, futures for which young people can take concrete, if small, steps and that they can influence the decisions that they make right now. It's important to note, of course, that these classifications are not meant to kind of hierarchically organize or evaluate different kinds of futures, but just as a way to help distinguish between the futures that young people are imagining and the associated pathways that they see through education. Second here are navigational capacities that young people seek to support them in connecting imagined futures and plausible futures. Ideas like street smarts, understanding the rules of the game, certificates, social and economic opportunities, not in a geographically and geopolitically confined space, but with a much more expansive lens on where future building might happen. So I'd like to look at one classroom now and a group of students and teachers in a school in Beirut, Lebanon, to look at a particular moment of civic experience in schools for refugees and go back to this big question of what happens when what you study in school is not allowing you to weave the threads of an individual and collective past, present, and future. This school is one where Lebanese nationals attend school in the morning and Syrian refugees in the afternoon, often called a second shift. Inside the courtyard of the school, there's lots of art on the walls, and it includes a fair amount of students' colorful drawings. There are also Lebanese army flags on the courtyard windows and a Lebanese flag flying outside the school. There are also symbols in the school of an education that is connected to global as well as national influences. So the graph paper notebooks that grade 9 students take out in physics class are imprinted with the logo of the United Nations. And at the front of the class, there's an audiovisual cabinet with a USAID sticker on it. Inside is the equipment that would be used to control the projector, which is tightly fixed to the ceiling. The projector is not used in lessons in the afternoon. 14-year-old Arif, one of our participants, explained that the projector is only for the first shift and it stays locked when Syrians are at school. He was so habituated to these kind of messages of exclusion that he didn't question this practice of when it was used and by whom. In addition to these kind of structural messages of exclusion, Syrian young people described how they find themselves excluded from what they're taught in the curriculum. This was an example that I gave in the article that Leslie had put in the chat in a grade 9 curriculum on civic education. Young people are taught a class on the right to file administrative complaints. And in this school, the teacher, the teacher was really subtly calling out the contradictions for Syrian students, learning about methods of filing complaints when Syrians did not have the right to do so. But in most schools, they were just learning about the right to file a complaint and knowing that they were excluded from that right, but needing to learn it in order to pass their exams. Teachers adopted a stance that they would teach the curriculum as prescribed within this nationalized system of education, even if it didn't apply to refugees. And this is a complex negotiation. Teachers were doing their job. They are agents of the state and covering the curriculum so that students can pass their exams. We also observe students to question this kind of power. Munir, another student who was in our study, was also in grade 9, age 16, and he lodged complaints against his teacher's way of teaching every day through constantly asking questions of the teacher. In a different civics lesson on education, the teacher explained that education challenges poverty and is a pathway for a better life, basically as a note to write down in one's notebook. But Munir went on to ask a series of questions about whether education really could be a clear pathway out of poverty for him and for his peers who were all Syrian, without explicit attention to the kinds of power dynamics around them and the rights that they had in Lebanon. But despite his confidence in engaging in these kinds of discussions in class, the relational exclusion that Munir and his peers felt while being included in Lebanese public schools often felt to them like a punch in the face, the kind of physical violence that was around them. So in one example, for a chemistry project, Munir's friends had made a chart of the periodic table. And the chemistry teacher was so impressed and decided that she would put it on the wall so the entire class could see it. She told the class that she thought even the Lebanese students who would come in the morning shift could use this chart, and she left it hanging on the wall. The next morning, though, when the students came to school, what they found was that their chart that they had made was torn to pieces and was lying on the floor. This image is from an animation that we're working on in collaboration with an organization called Positive Negatives. So when the friends and Munir found this chart, Mohammed and Hussein, Munir's friends, were upset that someone would do this. When the teacher came, Munir stood up for his friends and he showed her the torn chart and explained how upset his friends were. Then, by way of explanation, the teacher said that the students in the morning shift felt like Munir and his friends were intruders on the school. This idea made Munir even more upset, and he said he wanted to rip up all of their work. He said they should respect us the same way we respect them. Then it seemed to only make it worse when the principal told the class that maybe the students did this to the periodic table because, after all, it was their school first. Munir, upset as he was also resigned again in some ways to this kind of second-class status. He said, it's like they're giving the school to us so we can learn, but not to be established. So here I wanted to come back to this triangle as we think about the positions of refugees within hosting nation states and the kind of global politics that really entrench these kinds of systems, making it really hard for refugee young people to connect their past, their present, and their future. As Munir described, his commitment to education involved trade-offs, learning now, but with the impossibility of being established, no guarantee of where his education might lead. Munir's teachers felt a responsibility to teach refugee young people like Munir in the present, yet with this ever-present daily concern for the stability of their own country and the accompanying need to assert that the school is, after all, for Lebanese children first. At the same time, we see nation states like Lebanon, where almost a quarter of the population are Syrian refugees, invest in refugee education in the present, supported by funds from external donors, but ones that are very unpredictable and limited, and with a kind of uncertain future collective benefit in terms of the economic and social returns that are usually used to politically justify any kind of national investment in education. So what possibilities are there for positive peace when refugees are caught within these national spaces in which they're marginalized from recognition that would enable learning, future opportunities, and equal opportunities for life outcomes? In the last part of the presentation today, before we turn to discussion, I'd like to turn to some of our emerging findings for these possibilities as they relate to the role of teachers. In particular, teachers as experience creators. So we see teachers representing the state, but also wielding significant discretionary power within classrooms about how they teach in particular, also as agents of future building. And in terms of this agents of future building, we see teachers' roles in developing navigational capacities, supporting young people to continue in their studies, to develop a kind of street smarts and understanding of the rules of the game so that they can know how to, for example, pass their exams and how to get to the next stage of schooling, but also critically shaping aspirations and pathways and being very explicit in this development of the navigational capacities that young people can use to create their futures. So more specifically, we're seeing 4 mechanisms that are really interacting in refugee young people's schooling that they connect with their capacities to build futures and be civic actors. And these are structures, content, pedagogy, and relationships. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about each one. In particular, with the structures of schooling, refugee young people experience a disconnect between the futures they've imagined and the futures they've planned for, this feeling of being constantly behind and unable to catch up. One of our participants, Amin, used this phrase, being behind, to describe how he felt as a refugee student studying in Lebanon. This phrase really captures the way in which Syrian students are behind. The structures in which Syrian students come later in the day, literally behind Lebanese students. Refugee students often having had to miss out on years of schooling because of conflict and displacement, often placed in lower grades when arriving in Lebanon. And the second shift students, Syrians, always being behind in the curriculum as compared to morning shift students who have longer hours of study and at times teachers who are more highly trained than the teachers in the afternoon. Our participants also felt that they belonged to a second-class status, as I talked about earlier, as a result of this structure. Morning's a better time to study than the afternoon, they said. There are less hours of instruction in the second shift. Morning shift students have more teachers, have more subjects like computer lessons and drawing. And importantly, they don't feel like the classroom or the school is really theirs because it is first used and meant for Lebanese students, a message that they receive over and over again. So this is a quote from one of our participants in that way. They're Lebanese and their school is Lebanese. For sure. There's no country that favors others over its own citizens, right? In Syria, we also have our own school and it's not theirs. It's very nation state centric kind of view of whose school belongs to whom. In terms of content, we see students describing very clearly that the formal Lebanese curriculum is what is followed. They're really striving for success on the brevet, which is the end of 9th grade exam, and see that as a way to enable a kind of plausible future. And all of our participants had this goal. Yet what they also see about the content is that it is silent on their experiences as refugees in Lebanon, in terms of the conflict in Syria, and the challenges that they face as young adults with a limited or no role for them as civic actors. So one student said what they hear from their teachers is, don't interfere with politics. We're here to study, not to talk about these issues. And so they're asking, how will I figure out my future without guidance, examples, and narratives that relate to me? Unlike the structures and content of schooling, refugee young people described to us ways in which pedagogy and relationships seemed more changeable, more able to make space for them. So 4 elements that students described valuing were order in the classroom so that they could really follow along and hear what was going on. Teachers' role in explaining materials and concepts, not only in terms of supporting students in language learning, but also in going in depth to understand the meaning behind any particular concept. Teachers who balanced strictness with care, creating the order, but also this kind of power sharing and listening with students. So one student said, the teacher doesn't leave it like this. He explains it and tells us about it, about each phase. This was a science class, and what happened and what they did throughout the lesson, feeling like he could really get into the process of what was going on. In terms of pedagogy, students have found that effective teachers supported them not to just accept the structures and content, but to overcome them and find ways, even though they were immovable in so many ways, to make those structures and content work for them. And they created conditions for making more plausible their kinds of imagined futures. And this really connects into the ideas of relationships. Students found unwelcome in so many parts of their daily lives and often heard comments from teachers along the lines of this first one. You Syrians, we are hosting you in our country and this is how you behave, feeling like they were not worthy of the school. But students also described how there were many teachers who didn't at all make us feel like we were entering a country that isn't ours, that really strove to create these relationships of belonging. And the particular elements that students described valuing really center on care, dignity, and worth. She was not teaching with disgust and interest, one student said. And this idea of equality in teaching. In particular, students really wanted to know that they were learning in the afternoon the same kind of content that would allow them to pass the exam as students were learning in the morning. The pedagogical and relational messages that young people received and understood around order, around control of what was said, around participation and explaining, were both constraining and enabling, and are really shaping the kinds of citizens that refugee children are socialized into being and becoming, the way they link their imagined and plausible futures. So if we look at all of these together, we see that these 4 mechanisms interacting in refugee young people's schooling experiences connect with their capacities to be civic actors and build futures. So the structures of schooling and the content of what they learn, the language they learn in, the high stakes nature of learning content for an exam, and how they felt left out of the curriculum. Syrian young people in our study, as in other studies globally, really saw the structure and the content as pretty fixed. But the pedagogy, the way that teachers teach the content and engage students in the material on explaining and making relevant, and the relationships of schooling with teachers, with other students, and outside of school, really enabled students to seek support that would be specific to them, that would work toward this recognition of the ways in which they were trying to build their futures within the particular constraints of the structure and the content of learning. In our data, we see that the most effective teachers from young people's descriptions were those who use these relationships as the foundation of their pedagogy, and in particular supported young people to navigate explicitly the content and structures of schooling by way of this kind of relational pedagogy. These four elements begin to make up a kind of key toolbox of navigational capacities that refugee young people describe as important to them as they seek to build their futures. So here we have our rabbit sitting in the box again. And as we think about Munir's experience, for example, at a school in Beirut, it's clear that he's learning many things. He's learning how to factor numbers. He told us how he learned about covalent bonds when teachers were grasping hands with two other students and acting it out in class. But he's also learning that the teachers he thought cared about, he and his friends, wouldn't stand up for them when Lebanese young people treated them unfairly and ripped up the poster. He's learning that he does not have the same rights as his Lebanese peers and having a really hard time connecting the strands of his past with his present and his imagined future. I think it's important to note that most of the discussion on refugee education globally continues to focus on this idea, we see this in the current pandemic as well, of avoiding a lost generation. And I think the focus of these campaigns is really misplaced. It continues to be on ensuring that no refugee child be denied their right to an education while in exile. But a lost generation for students like Munir means so much more than that. It's a kind of generation that misses out on access to an education that does provide resources and recognition, skills and knowledge to build these kind of futures that include equal opportunities and life chances. On the last page of this Not a Box book, the young rabbit comes up with a new idea, basically saying, well, if it can't be this and it can't be that and it can't be this, then maybe it's just my not a box. So as we continue to think about these spaces that education can create for refugee young people to be civic actors and build futures, I'm really looking forward to thinking with all of you about how we might imagine what this not a box might actually be. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dryden Peterson. That was really interesting. So I want to remind everyone who's listening, please use the Q&A or the chat function, either one, to register comments or questions. I'm going to start us off. Sarah, I was thinking about your slide where you talk about negative and positive peace, and you think about resource-based inequality and identity-based inequality. And I was thinking about how to link that with your 2020 article where you talk about structural but not relational inclusion. How do those ideas fit together?
Yeah, so I think we see this in the current structure of refugee education globally, this idea of including refugees in national education systems is a kind of structural approach to inclusion, of access to a school, a textbook, a teacher, an experience of learning every day. But what we see is very little attention. So this is the kind of resource-based inequality. So where it's been really hard for many refugee young people to access schools, to physically be in a school. This kind of model of inclusion builds on an already existing national system and a core of teachers to be able to mitigate that kind of resource inequality. But the identity-based inequalities that young people are facing in schools really are about the relational interaction. So whether that's a relationship with a curriculum that they don't see themselves represented within, whether that's a relationship with peers, as we see the kind of structure of schooling in Lebanon that I was describing really leads to separate experiences which don't allow the kinds of relationships among young people who don't actually ever come together in school. They share the school space, but are not able to build relationships. And this kind of relational integration that would allow teachers to do more of what we're starting to see in our data of developing these kind of pedagogies that try to address histories of conflict, that try to address refugees' identities within a country of exile, taking into account all of the different kinds of exclusions that their families may be facing in terms of work or life, not just as written in the curriculum, but as experienced. So I think there is a real parallel there between this kind of focus on structural integration and addressing resource inequities, and a shift, hopefully, to a more relational process of integration that would lead to more space for addressing the kind of identity-based inequities that young people are facing.
I have another question that's popped up in the Q&A from an attendee, which is saying, would you say priority should be given to placing students with peers of similar ability levels or age if those two factors don't match up, or an in-between balance of both?
Yeah, I think this is a really hard question. Some of the first classrooms that I spent time in a refugee context were in Uganda in the early 2000s. And at that time, there were kids who were 13, 14, 15 in primary 1 and primary 2 classes, and classes of 150, kind of really wanting to pursue their education, but being unable to develop any of the kinds of relationships of learning that would allow them to feel comfortable there, that would allow them to feel confident, that would allow them to feel like they could learn at their developmental stage, even if they had never been given access to some of these early tools that were being taught in the class. And so I think it's a really, what the students who we've been working with in Beirut would describe that experience of basically feeling like they were being pushed down and made to stay behind, not being given the opportunity to rise to the occasion when they would have experience within a class. And so many of them would argue, and actually did, kind of work to try to get their siblings placed in a grade level that was for age, rather than the kind of missed years of schooling, to allow those kind of relationships to develop. But I think that one of the biggest issues in many refugee contexts is connected to language as well. And so being able to create the kinds of supports that can allow young people to gain the language skills and gain the comfort in developing those relationships of learning in order to interact with their peers is so critical. So I think it's a both and in many ways. And I think this is part of what is so hard in many refugee contexts, where the numbers of young people entering an education system very quickly can make it hard to think about how do you marshal this number of resources and really develop this capacity for teachers to support students in these ways.
So we have a question from John Marino, who says that was a fascinating talk. Thank you so much. I'm curious if the young people in your study wrestle with the refugee label at all in the context of their learning. Do they express different definitions of the term? Do they see it as a label that empowers or marginalizes them and negotiate their use of it differently in different times and places for different purposes? Given that it's a legal term as opposed to asylum seeker or IDP, for example, but also a matter of identity in the way we organize programs and study these children, I'd be curious how children themselves talk about the term's work in their lives.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for this question, Jonathan. This is something that we've been thinking a lot about. And I think just as your question really puts forth, there's so many ways in which individuals can experience this label of refugee. And certainly it can be a label, a term that is rejected and does come with this sense of exclusion. And students in our studies in many places talk about being bullied with the term. And so I think it's a term that is really tricky and challenging to use in that way. We try to use it in our work for two reasons that I see in your question also. One is that in some places, and in Lebanon, this is not the case, for example, because Lebanon is not signatory to the 1951 Refugee Convention. So Syrians actually don't have refugee status. But in some places, there is a real importance of the kind of legal status of being a refugee that can provide access to these kinds of services and to an ability to remain in a geographic place over time that is critical. And so a feeling like one would want to adopt that identity in order to access those kinds of rights. And then another way, really thinking about this idea of kind of hearkening back to the idea of refuge, rather than refugee, and thinking about what that means, not just for someone who might have the legal status of a refugee, for example, but that this is a community need, a reciprocal process that requires more than just one person to create that kind of refuge, to create those possibilities for existing together. So this is not something that we've studied systematically in terms of looking at use of the term and people's perceptions of it, but certainly in our conversations with young people, we hear that range of experiences with and embracing or rejecting the term itself.
Okay, so we have another question in the Q&A from an attendee about how do you gain teacher and administration support in these efforts? I think the efforts being referred to are integrating children into schools.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for this question too. So I think that, again, this depends on the context, and we've seen different things in different places. So the kind of history that I described of refugee education that looks at these like very distinct time periods, a kind of liberation, standardization, nationalization, is an oversimplification of what has happened historically. So this era of standardization I have found really interesting, where refugee education really kind of guided by global policy. But some of, again, my kind of first work in refugee context in Uganda, what we really saw was these policies and decisions being made at very local contexts. So while refugees had no legal status outside of refugee settlements in Uganda, while refugees were not entitled to access government schools, school principals saying, but these children live here and our school is set up for the children who live here, and so would simply register those students as part of the school. And so very much a kind of local policymaking in context, because refugee and national children were living together and going to school together. I think in settings where there are large numbers and an inadequate number of resources, be that classrooms or teachers, it becomes much harder to negotiate and navigate this kind of tension, both for teachers and administrators. I think the example of Lebanon is really interesting in this way too, because the government has exhibited a fair amount of pushback on global donors who have promised funding to support refugee young people in school, and those funds have not come through. And so this question of who's responsible for the education of refugees, if a global community is saying, well, we're committing to this responsibility sharing, and then a national system, in fact, has limited capacity to support the education of citizens, what does that mean then for refugee children in turn if that funding does not come through as promised? And so individual teachers and administrators needing to make those decisions within their own schools, but also being part of a larger system where they often feel threatened and might lose their jobs if they make certain decisions that are counter to national policy. So again, I think it is this very local kind of process in most places, but something that's so key. I mean, I think that the most challenging role of teachers in that way, including the teacher who had this conversation with Munir and his friends about the poster, is that they have these multiple and conflicting needs that they need to meet. They need to cover the curriculum because they are supposed to prepare students for exams. They need to teach that curriculum because that is their obligation as an agent of the state. And they see the very needs that students have that may be outside of those other spheres and struggle to figure out how to meet those needs within the structures in which they're meant to teach. And I think that those of us who have been teachers feel that tension in varying degrees, depending on where we're teaching and how tightly scripted those roles are in terms of the curriculum in particular.
So Lily Schmitz has a question. What is your perspective on an educator's role in identity creation for refugee students? Do you see this as an obligation for teachers?
Thank you, Lily, for this question. This is a question we've been thinking a lot about in terms of some of our research, particularly in Dadaab camp in Kenya and also in Beirut in Lebanon, where students describe the kinds of relationships that they have with their teachers who are refugees and not their teachers who are nationals, that are very different one from the other. And the kinds of ways in which, for example, Somali teachers in Dadaab or Syrian teachers in Lebanon, in one particular school that we studied, are able to support young people in these kinds of relationships that I was describing, or in navigating some of the social and economic and political constraints, both in the curriculum and also in their lives outside of school. And thinking a lot about whether kind of wanting to believe that it's possible for not only teachers who have a kind of identity match with students to meet these kinds of needs, but also to develop those kinds of capacities in all of us as teachers. And so thinking about some of the elements that enable teachers to do that, and particularly ideas of politicized caring and political clarity that have been much more developed in pedagogies by Black educators in the US, in really a concrete and explicit awareness of experiences of oppression and identity-based inequities that teachers are able to engage with young people on to help them process their own experiences, enact some kinds of roles of protection, but also make that actually part of the learning and part of the relationship. And we see that a lot more when there is an educator who shares some elements of those identities in a refugee context, and who shares some of those experiences. What is it like to be a Syrian in Lebanon, having that as their lived experience? But trying to think about some of these mechanisms that we might build into our teacher education programs in many situations to enable all educators to do some of this critical work.
So I have a question from Sarah. Have you found ways to share your research with people who are responsible for refugee education outside of academia? As in their experience, many organizations who are in charge of refugee education are not well introduced to academic research.
Thank you, Sarah, for this question. This has been one of the most, I think, inspiring and engaging parts of the work that I've done, is trying to engage with local community organizations, with governments, with UN and global agencies on some of this work. Actually partly got into some of this work when someone who was working at UNHCR headquarters, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees headquarters in Geneva, sent me like a 2-sentence email that said, why is it whenever I visit a refugee setting, everyone tells me their most important priority is education, and I get back to Geneva and nobody's talking about education. Like, can you tell me why this is? And I feel like that became a puzzle that I was just obsessed with for many years, of trying to figure out, well, here's this real disconnect between what I was seeing in my research and spending time in schools and what was going on with policy. And so trying to develop these relationships over time with those who do make policy decisions, for example, around refugee education, to have ongoing conversations. And we've tried to do that in work with governments in the countries that we work with as well, particularly around teacher training, as some of the elements and questions we've just talked about, as refugees are included in national education systems, which in many countries is still a very new endeavor. What does that mean for teacher training, and what kind of training might be included for teachers, all teachers, as this becomes more kind of consistent situation? So I'd love to talk more about this. This is something that I really love to do, but I also find it very hard. So learning from others in this way as well.
So we have another question. Are there any countries you can point to that are doing excellent work in refugee education? And if so, what are the lessons that we could learn from them?
Yeah, I think this is a great question too. Thank you for it. I think that a lot of the work that we do is really trying to focus on practices that do promote the kind of positive piece or addressing these kinds of inequalities. So actively looking for really productive examples. In our work, most of those examples that we find are at a very local level and not a kind of countrywide approach that seems to be working in terms of doing this kind of excellent job. I think there are important lessons to be learned from countries that have created legal structures in which refugees are able to move freely, in which refugees are able to access employment legally, in which refugees are able to legally access schools. Even in countries that do that, such as Uganda, it's very hard to actually access those opportunities. And so while the legal structure is in place, the kind of learning that goes on in schools is still really challenged by many of the elements that we talked about today. I think really important to this, though, is that in many, if not most of these situations, these kinds of challenges are not unique to refugee young people. Some of the work that we've been doing in Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya, the Kakuma is in one of the counties in Kenya, regions of Kenya, where learning levels are also incredibly low among nationals, where access to resources and trained teachers is incredibly low. And so while it's important to focus on refugee education for lots of the different reasons that we've been talking about, it's really important to focus on refugees within the context in which they're learning. Many of nationals are just as marginalized along many of these different dimensions, even if not legal status, as refugee young people. And I think this is obviously a challenge within the US too, in terms of who has access to what quality of schooling and the kind of segregation and marginalization that happens when, as Tim Williams writes, that poor kids have access to poor schools. And this is prevalent globally. And we see these heightened tensions for refugees, but the kind of approaches that are more holistic in thinking about communities and whole groups of kids in schools, not just refugees and nationals, seem most productive in that way.
I think we might have time for one more question. I've got Lee is asking, Lee's saying, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation, and asking how can we help students unlearn the feeling of exclusion in educational settings, seek to prioritize inclusivity and support, and is there a trust issue in the relationships with their teachers?
Thank you, Lee, for this question. I think this is hopefully the future of work that many of us will be doing. Trying to really focus on what are the elements that make a welcoming community, that enable schools to be places that do have this kind of inclusivity and support. I do think that trust, that we in the work in Lebanon and other work in Kenya, in South Africa, we see this kind of trust in grown-ups in school settings as being so key to figuring out how to navigate, but also these relationships with peers, and really thinking about the ways in which young people are developing relationships of support with each other. And I think that there are many different kind of levels in which these welcoming communities can be created. So some is through the structures, that while young people in our studies really find the structure and content immovable, these are still important areas to move in terms of ensuring that curriculum can represent all students, that students can show up to class knowing that they will not feel excluded from what they are learning, to ensure that young people do have the opportunity to interact one with another, as well as the kind of pedagogical and relational elements with both teachers and with peers. And I think so important to this, again, this is not unique to refugee situations, but the kind of mismatch between what young people experience in schools that are fairly successful in doing these things, that do make kids feel welcome, that have a broad curriculum that really does feel inclusive and representative and recognizes young people, and the mismatch between that and what young people are experiencing outside of schools in their daily lives in terms of violence, inequity, unequal opportunities to economic possibilities. is something that we need to keep addressing, because no matter how inclusive we make that school space, if what young people see outside doesn't represent that kind of promise that they see for what society might look like, then both it doesn't actually create these kind of equitable opportunities. And what we see in refugee education is it feels like this unfulfillable promise. Like, you told me if I did these things, if I succeeded in school, if I learned, if I trusted, if I respected and cared, that I could access these opportunities. And then what I find outside is not that. It leads to a kind of lack of trust that way as well. Thanks for the question.
So we want to thank you, Dr. Dryden Peterson, for an engaging, informative, and inspiring talk today. Thank you so much. All of you who are listening, I put in the chat our next 2 events. Hope you can join us for those. And we wish everyone a great afternoon. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Leslie, Allie, and everyone.